will cover three topics in the UDO: parking, landscape and screening, and open space. The way this will work is that I'll run through several slides on the topics. If you have questions or comments as we go, please enter them in the chat feature of Zoom. And our team and our consultants will try to respond to your comments in real time as I'm going through the slides. And then when I'm finished, if we need to, we can go back and address some of the comments that hadn't been answered, or take any comments that may come up after the presentation is over. Just so we know that you can use the chat and we know who you are, if you don't mind right now, just opening the chat feature in Zoom and just typing in your name. And then if you're associated or affiliated with an organization or a company or a neighborhood, just tell us that too, if you'd like, just so we have that as part of our chat recording for tonight's virtual conversation. So the purpose of this is to hopefully give you an understanding of where to find the UDO requirements for parking, landscape and screening, and open space, and to help you learn about the various topics that are covered in each of the articles for those requirements in the UDO. And then we'll do a very high level review of some of the specific requirements for each of those sections. So before I get into the material, just a quick discussion about our current schedule. We released the first draft of the UDO in October. We're currently in our public engagement and comment period, where we have been out to the public and some in-person and virtual meetings. We are collecting comments through our online portal, through our website. We've been meeting with various organizations and interests to discuss the UDO. And all of this will result in a revised version of the UDO, a second version, a red line version, so that any changes can be easily seen. And all of this leading through the adoption process to hopefully a vote and adoption by the City Council in July of this year. So let's get into it then. Where are the parking requirements in the UDO found? They're in Part 8 of the General Development Zoning Standards, and specifically Article 19, off-street vehicle and bicycle parking. And the screen clip that you're seeing on the screen is from the UDO's table of contents, which is 4 or 5 pages long. And if you start with the table of contents, you'll be able to see where all of the 40 articles, I believe it is, in the UDO are, and a general listing of what is covered in each of the articles, and then the page of the UDO that it begins on. So we're going to start with parking, which is in Article 19. Our parking requirements in the UDO are based on a 3-tier system, which relies on zoning districts to determine which parking tier would be applicable for a project. So if you haven't been with us for in a while or ever, these are the proposed zoning districts in the UDO. These are all new zoning districts. They don't, we're not carrying through any of our current conventional zoning districts. So our new UDO zoning districts are divided into neighborhood zoning districts, which are, as the name implies, primarily residential. Employment districts, which includes commercial, institutional, campus rather, manufacturing and logistics, and innovation mixed use, and our centers zoning districts for neighborhood centers, community activity centers, regional activity centers, transit-oriented development. And then we have an outlier district, the manufactured home parking district. So the parking requirements are divided, or actually, as I said, we're using a 3-tiered approach to parking. Depending on the zoning district of the development site, the project would fall into one of these 3 tiers, with tier 1 having minimum off-street parking requirements and no parking maximums. The zoning districts in tier 2 would have both a minimum and a maximum off-street parking requirement. And tier 3, which would be our more urban zoning districts, would have in most cases no parking minimums, and rather instead would have parking maximums. So we'll go through those 3 tiers briefly, just so that you can see how that works. As I said, the zoning districts in tier 1 would have a minimum parking requirement and no maximum parking requirement. And the minimum parking requirement would be, for example, for a single family home, it would be 2 parking spaces per unit. For other, like a multifamily, it would typically be 1.5 spaces per unit. And for non-residential uses in tier 1, they differ according to the various uses. A typical commercial use would be would require 1 space per 500 square feet as a minimum. And again, that's just a typical. It would vary depending on the specific use. The districts in tier 2, I went over them earlier, but they would have both a minimum parking requirement as well as a maximum parking requirement. Again, for the residential, the minimum would be typically 1 space per unit, and the maximum would be 2 spaces per unit. And for the non-residential, again, typical, not necessarily for every non-residential use, the minimum would be 1 per 750, and the maximum would be 1 per 250. And then finally, tier 3, in most cases would not have a minimum parking requirement, but instead would have a maximum. The exception to this is that for multifamily residential and other uses like live performance venues, nightclubs, and restaurants and bars that are within 200 feet of neighborhood 1 zoning, there would be a minimum parking requirement. Also in this article will be an explanation of how vehicle parking spaces are calculated. When their off-street parking is required. For example, new construction of a principal building would require provision of off-street parking when there is a minimum parking requirement. When an existing building is expanded, that would result in a requirement of more than 10 additional spaces, or a change of use or expansion of an existing use that would result in a requirement of more than 10 additional spaces. So if any of those things happen, then the minimum parking requirements would apply. Some parking spaces are exempt from the parking maximum requirements, and these include required ADA parking spaces, EVSE, electric vehicle installed spaces, any pickup or drop off spaces as part of the development, such as those set aside for ride hailing or delivery. Also, any on-street parking spaces that abut the site would not count toward maximums. And then finally, townhouse and multifamily would be allowed to have visitor parking areas that would exceed any parking maximums. I mentioned electric vehicles. The UDO will have a requirement for some uses for some EV parking capability, depending on the amount of parking that's provided. So it's, as we get to in the next slide, there are 3 types of EV parking capability that we're talking about here. And the first is simply EV capable. And simply all that means is that the electrical panel for the project has the capacity for future EV charging parking spaces, and that we make room in the panel. And then we run a raceway out to the future EV parking area. The second would be EV ready, which is everything in EV capable, but in addition, an actual 240 volt outlet that's accessible to those parking spaces. And then finally, the highest level EVSE installed, which is the actual installation of a level 2 EV charging station. And that photo has some examples of what some of those look like. So for multifamily stacked dwellings and for the residential component of mixed use development, as well as for hotels and parking lots and parking structures as a principal use, they will have a requirement for EV charging if there are 10 or more parking spaces provided. And you can see the table at the top of this slide, which is taken directly from the UDO. There are various requirements for all three types of EV parking, depending on the number of parking spaces provided. EV parking spaces, or rather EVSE installed parking spaces won't be counted toward parking maximums. And if they are provided and there's a parking minimum, they would count as 2 spaces. Also in this article will be standards for the location of parking and access to parking. They're found in Article 19.6 and also in Table 19-4, and there's a screenshot of part of that table. And various standards may differ according to zoning district for the parking area location and access. Article 19 also has standards for the design of parking structures. I won't get too deeply into those other than to say that according to the frontage type or the street type, if you will, and the zoning district, there may be one or more options for how the frontage, or rather how the exterior frontage facing portion of those parking structures are treated. And you can see option A, B, C, or D, and they go all the way from a fully wrapped parking deck on all stories to just having active ground floor uses with screening above, or in some cases on certain frontages in some districts, no requirement for ground floor active use, but instead an increased setback and some landscaping. Article 19 also has requirements for bicycle parking, just as it does for vehicle parking. Bike parking is also required when a new building is constructed or an existing building is expanded. That would result in a requirement for 5 or more additional spaces, or a change of use that would result in a requirement of more than 5 spaces. Bike parking is looked at both in short-term parking spaces as well as long-term parking. Typically, long-term bike parking will be expressed as a percentage of the total required bike spaces. You can see that a little more clearly as we'll show you an example of the parking matrix in the UDO, and you can see how that works. There is, in most cases, a minimum of 2 short-term bike parking spaces provided for any use, and then there are maximums for very large projects, so that there are no more than a certain number of parking. If the project is very large, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to provide 1,000 bike parking spaces. Also, in the bike parking section, you'll find standards for bike racks. And in most cases, the standards for bike racks will reference the Charlotte Land Development Standards Manual standards. Those are the ones that we'll be using. So those standards are not actually found in Article 19, but they are referenced. You can see in the top left slide just an example from the Land Development Standards Manual for a post and ring bike rack, which is one of the approved short-term bike parking racks that can be used. And also a photo of a long-term bike parking locker, which is one way you can meet some of the long-term bike parking requirements. And there is some flexibility for creative design of bicycle parking as well, as you can see in the upper right. So here is a portion of the bike parking table from the UDO. Looks kind of similar to a vehicle parking requirement, in that it lists uses in the left-hand column, and then the total required bike spaces in the middle column, and then on the right-hand column, the percentage of those total spaces that should be dedicated for long-term bike parking. There are some uses that won't have a minimum bicycle parking requirement, specifically things like single-family homes, duplexes, triplexes, quads, and townhomes. Those kinds of dwellings, typically, if the residents had to bike, they have the ability to bring them inside or into a garage or something like that. Excuse me. And then there are some non-residential uses that may not have minimum bike parking requirements because it just doesn't make sense. Like, for example, a car wash or and some industrial uses. So that is a quick overview of the parking article in the UDO Article 19. And next we'll talk about the UDO landscape and screening requirements, which are also in Part 8, the General Development Zoning Standards, but they are in Article 21. And the reason we've got standards for landscaping and screening is first to preserve and enhance the appearance and the character of our city, but also to increase the compatibility of adjacent uses and minimize the adverse impact of objectionable activities or impacts on neighboring uses, and to create transitional areas between uses or districts of different intensities. The types of landscaping and screening that are covered in this article are parking lot perimeter landscape, parking structure landscape, and landscape yards, which in our current ordinance are referred to as buffers, but in the UDO will be called landscape yards. And then screening for loading areas and solid waste surfaces. I'm just going to take a break for a second to get something to drink. My throat is a little dry. Okay, thank you. This article also covers the selection, installation, and maintenance of landscape material. Again, referencing some standards in the Charlotte Land Development Standards Manual, such as the tree planting detail that you see on the left of the screen, as well as the list of approved plant species, which is also in the Land Development Standards Manual. So any required landscape material has got to be taken from that approved plant species to ensure that it survives and thrives in our environment. There are also requirements, and this is a new requirement in the UDO, for species diversity. So depending on the number of required landscape plants, there may be a requirement to diversify the species to ensure that we don't risk losing plants, landscape material to disease, and also for the maintenance of required landscape material, including the replacement, removal and replacement of anything that's damaged. Parking lot perimeter landscaping. Surface parking lots are required to be screened at the edge of the parking lot. And this is a requirement for parking lots of 10 spaces or more. And the screening would also apply to driveways and maneuvering areas that are within required side and rear setbacks. And the parking lot perimeter landscaping would be required, and this requirement would be triggered with the construction of a new principal building, or when spaces are added to an existing parking lot where the total of the existing and the new is 10 or more spaces, or reconstruction of 50% or more of an existing parking lot. When we say reconstruction, we're not talking about simple maintenance like resurfacing or restriping, but actual, regrading and reconstruction. If there's a bulldozer involved, that's kind of the rule of thumb. There are a few exceptions to parking lot perimeter landscaping when it does not have to be provided. For example, when parking areas are shared between properties, you don't have to screen down the property line. If a landscape yard is also required, then the landscape yard would serve as the parking lot screening. If you have a vehicle dealership, the parking area used for display of vehicles for sale is not required to be screened from the street. Obviously, they want people to be able to see the vehicles that they've got for sale. Generally, the standards for parking lot screening are that a parking landscape area has to be at least 5 feet in width. And you'll see there are some standards for evergreen shrubs and the height when planted and the height when mature and so forth. The goal obviously is to be able to visually screen parked vehicles from view. There are a couple of design options for how you can achieve the screening of the parking lot. One would be that landscape screening simply. And then there is another option for a low wall in addition to some landscaping. And there is a sketch in the UDO that you see here on the screen that kind of explains how that could work and what that may look like. Also, as I said, standards for landscaping of parking structures to soften the edge of those parking structures. And you can see a sketch from the UDO and a photo example of a parking structure that has done a fairly good job of landscaping to soften the edge of that. I won't go into all of the requirements for that, but just want to make you aware that there are requirements and this is where they're located in the UDO. And landscape yards, or as I said earlier, what we're currently calling buffers, may be required with new construction, with an addition, or if there's a use added that would be conducted primarily outdoors, or a change of use category may trigger a requirement for a landscape yard. Landscape yards are in the UDO divided into 3 categories, just as they are in our current zoning ordinance, A, B, and C, with A being the widest. The width of a Class A landscape yard will vary according to the size of the development site. So the larger the site, the wider the Class A landscape yard. However, Class B and C landscape yards are at a set width. Class B is 25 feet, as you can see in the table. Hopefully you can read that. And Class C is 10 feet. And then for each of those 3 classes, the table contains the landscape requirements for each of those, as well as if there is a fence or wall required, any height requirements for fences and walls. The Class A landscape yard, as I mentioned, is the widest, and it's divided into 2 zones. The first 25 feet, or the 25 feet closest to the property lines, are more heavily landscaped than the remainder, although there is some requirement for landscaping, the zone 2, as we call it. But zone 1, the first 25 feet, are a more intensely developed or landscaped portion of the Class A landscape yard. And table 21-3 in this article will tell you what type of landscape yard, if any, would be required with a certain development, whether it's A, B, or C. And that depends on the zoning district of the property that's being developed, the type of development that's going on, and the type of property that it is abutting. So as you read across in this table, you can find your zoning district and then look at the type of development that's happening. And then based on what you're abutting it will tell you whether your requirement will be for an A, B, or C buffer yard. In some cases, there may not be a buffer yard requirement at all, particularly, for example, in between, in industrial sites or manufacturing and logistics sites. There may not be a requirement. The UDO will also have some diagrams that illustrate the location of the required buffer yards. This is one example of that. And finally, the last part of this section is any required screening, and we'll talk about a couple of screening requirements. The first is for loading areas. In all zoning districts except for the ML1 and ML2, which is manufacturing and logistics, or the equivalent of our current industrial zoning districts. In all but those, exterior loading areas must be screened from all streets and frontages and along required side and rear setbacks with a minimum 75% opaque wall or fence of 6 to 8 feet in height. If you're within the ML1 or ML2 district, you can have a loading area to the side or rear of the building that does not have to be screened. However, if any loading areas are visible from a public or required street, then you've got to at least install the parking lot style of screening for those loading areas if they're visible from the street. And then finally, internal loading areas, such as the one in the photo, have to be screened with loading doors, which must remain closed when not in use. There is also a requirement for screening of large waste containers such as dumpsters, as well as recycling stations and solid waste service areas. They have got to be screened by on 3 sides by a minimum 75% opaque fence wall or wall extension that has to be a minimum of 1 foot up to a maximum of 2 feet above the container that's being screened. The 4th side of that enclosure must be gated, and the gate should stay closed when the dumpster or whatever the equipment inside is not being serviced. The zoning administrator has the ability to alter the landscape or the screening requirements of this article if one or more of the following conditions would make strict adherence to the requirements serve no meaningful purpose or would make it physically impossible to install and maintain, such as unusual topography or elevation or soil or some other subsurface condition that would not allow for the normal required landscape or screening to be met. As long as an alternative plan was presented that would show that the intent of the landscape yard or the screening would be met by an alternative means, then the zoning administrator has the ability and for some flexibility in administering this. So that's a quick run through the landscape and screening article of the UDO. And finally, we will talk about open space. The open space requirements are not all in one place. Article 16, specifically Article 16.4, covers the design of required on-site open space. It is also in Part 8, the General Development Zoning Standards, but there are also open space requirements in each of the individual zoning districts in the UDO that have an open space requirement. That is where you will find the actual numbers. So we'll talk a bit about both of these. When there is open space required, it shall meet the design requirements of Table 16-1, which is in that Article 16.4 I just talked about. And there are 3 types of open space, required open space, either public open space, common open space, or private open space. There may be a requirement for one or more of those specifically in some zoning districts. Driveways, sidewalks, parking areas, mailboxes, other things, tree save areas don't count toward your required on-site open space requirements. There are some uses that are exempt from open space requirements. Any uses in the categories of open space, recreation, and agricultural uses, infrastructure, or transportation in the use matrix aren't required to provide on-site open space. The use matrix is in Article 15. If you haven't looked at that yet, you will see that there are specific uses in each of those categories. So if you find a use and it happens to be, for example, in the recreation category of the use matrix, that use would not have an open space requirement. So just to go over what some of the actual open space requirement numbers are for zoning districts, I've broken it down into the neighborhood zoning districts, and then the next slide will be for the rest of the zoning districts because they're treated a little bit differently. But in any case, any new development, change of use, or expansion of a building by 1,000 square feet or 20%, whichever is less, is required to provide the open space that's specified for that zoning district and that use. Excuse me. For neighborhood zoning districts, the open space can be either private, common, or public, or any combination of that. So as you can see in the table, you've got the zoning districts for the neighborhood 1 and neighborhood 2 zoning districts listed across the top of the table. And down the left-hand column are the various residential and non-residential uses that may have an open space requirement. So let's just take, for example, the top line, a multifamily stacked development. If you were doing that in the N1F district, 10% of the total lot area would be required to be set aside as open space, either private, common, or public. If you were doing a townhouse, the open space is dealt with a little differently. There, it's a certain number of square feet per unit. So again, in that N1F district, you'll see that for a townhouse, and I'm down to the middle of the table, there's a requirement for 250 square feet of open space per unit. That 250 goes down a little bit if you get into the higher intensity zoning districts like the N2B and the N2C. There you only have to provide 150 square feet per unit rather than 250. And then for all of these neighborhood districts, for any non-residential development or mixed use development on sites greater than a half acre in size, there's a general requirement for 10% of the lot area to be provided as open space. Now for the employment and center zoning districts, it is simply a percentage of the lot area that is required to be open space. And in most cases, a percentage of that is required to be public open space. So this is a little bit different in how we treat it. So the top line, the total on-site open space, where you see the 5% and the 10% numbers, those are the percentages of the total lot area that are required to be reserved for open space. The lower numbers, the 25s and the 50s, that doesn't mean that you have to set aside 50% of the lot for open space. That means that 50% of the required either 5% or 10% has to be public open space. And that varies whether it's a commercial development or a mixed use development, or in the case of the campus zoning districts, for a campus development. So for example, let's just take, a commercial development, let's do it in the NC district. So stay with me here. In the NC district, 10% of the on-site open space, or rather 10% of the lot area would be set aside for open space. And of that 10% area, 50% of that would have to be public open space, minimum of 50%. I know it's a little tricky, but hopefully we'll get used to this. And then the open space requirements in the UDO may generally be a little higher than what they are in most of our current zoning districts, but there is more flexibility for where open space can be located. For example, all three types of open space, whether it's public, common, or private, can be located on decks, galleries, porches, terraces, patios, or even rooftops. So that kind of flexibility is not in our current ordinance. And also for multifamily and townhome or townhouse dwellings, private open space can also be located on balconies, porches, or decks. So it doesn't necessarily have to be in a yard specifically. It could be on a porch or a balcony or a deck. So table 16-1, which is in Article 16, will have some standards for the design of open space according to whether it's public, common, or private. And you can see what this looks like. So that covers the material for this evening. And I've just got a few closing slides I'd like to leave with. The first is that you have probably been to our website. The fact that you're here and registered tells me that you have. But if you've got comments, additional comments that you'd like to make on the draft UDO, you still have some time to do that. We are requiring that you use our online comment portal to make those comments rather than picking up the phone and calling one of us or sending us an email. And the reason we'd like you to do that through our online portal is that that gives us a solid record of what your comment is. We will publish all of those comments so that everybody else can see what all of the comments are that we've received. And then as we respond to those comments, and our goal is to respond to all of them, people will also be able to see how we have responded to these comments. So go to charlotteudo.org and click on down, read the UDO, and then that will take you to another page where you can comment on the UDO by specific topic. So I think you probably, if you're here, you probably have already been familiar with that. The UDO is a pretty big document. It's a little over 600 pages. So we don't expect anybody to read it, although I think we've got some people that have done that. But we've also prepared a 26-page reference guide, which is kind of a high-level walkthrough of all 40 articles of the UDO. And that's also available on our website at charlotteudo.org. If you go to the top menu bar and you click on the Helpful Resources tab, you'll see a drop-down menu and you'll see our reference guide. And I recommend that as kind of to give you a general understanding of how the UDO is organized and what's in each of those articles and a little bit more about them. Finally, or not finally, but almost, we released the first draft of the UDO on October 7th. As I mentioned earlier, we're currently in a community engagement phase. We are accepting comments on the first draft through January 14th, although there is some discussion about extending that. We'll have more information on that probably next week. And if you haven't done this already, I urge you to sign up for updates on our website. That way, as we have news to put out there, you will get an email. For example, if we do extend the deadline for comments, we will notify people that have signed up for updates, and you'll be one of the first to know. We're getting toward the end of our virtual conversation series, this one anyhow. We've got a couple of more after today. We did have a frequent user Q&A session that was originally scheduled for this past Tuesday, but we had not received a sufficient number of comments in advance to be able to actually have a useful session. So we're rescheduling that to January 27th. And next Tuesday, we will have another virtual conversation with the topics being required new streets, improvements, and associated standards. And that will be talking about articles in our subdivision streets and other infrastructure section of the UDO. Each of these virtual conversations is held twice a day, once at noon and again at 6 p.m. Same material covered in both sessions. And as you know, you need to register in advance to attend in order to get the Zoom link to join the meeting. So that concludes the presentation. I haven't been able to keep up with the chat because I've been too busy looking at slides, but I do see that we've got 11 entries in chat. So anyone who's been working in chat want to jump in and kind of give us a status of where we are?
Hi, Alan. Actually, we've been able to keep up really well with all the chat questions. So If anybody's curious, you can take a look in there. There's been answers to all the ones that have come along.
Thank you. Well, we've got a little bit of time left. If you've got questions or comments that you are just now thinking of that haven't been addressed that you'd like to enter into the chat now, please go ahead and do that while we're all here. We'll be here for another couple of minutes, but I don't want to keep everybody till 7 o'clock. If we can finish sooner, we can let everybody go. I'd like to thank you for coming tonight, and I encourage you to stay engaged and involved. And if you haven't signed up for updates, please go ahead and do that while you're thinking about it now and you're in front of your computer. And when we do have news to offer, you'll be among the first to know, and keep updated. So we really appreciate your attendance tonight. Thank you, Robert. Appreciate your being here too. Right, I think we're alone.